right, we are back for another episode of Beyond Barriers. Beyond Barriers is a conversation with leaders and community evangelists about the challenges of navigating an effective accessibility strategy. During these episodes, guests get to share their journey of successes and setbacks with a primary focus on how they've overcome issues that could have ended their accessibility journey. My name is Brian Gavin. I'm the co-founder of Wally and today's host. I'm delighted to be joined by Emily Ogle. Emily, thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you. It's been it's a good opportunity to be able to do something like this. And so my name is Emily Ogle, she, her. I'm a white woman with kind of like a lopsided haircut and blue glasses. And so it's always great to be able to participate in evangelizing and in sharing my journey, since there are so many journeys out there that just are very different from each other and but yet have so many similarities. So happy to be here. Thank you.
It's a pleasure. And like you said, it's been nice getting to know you. Um, you just hit the nail on the head, which is the journey that you've gone through is different than that of mine. And every person that has joined us on the podcast and other folks I get to speak to every day, everyone's journey is so different. So I'm sure that'll be some of the highlight of today's conversation is learning about how your journey has evolved and what makes it unique. Let's kind of open the conversation up with a little bit about yourself. How did you get into becoming an accessibility leader, and your exposure personally as well?
Yeah, so I consider myself to have had two journeys. So one, as a person with a lived disability, I am hard of hearing. And I was born, so I was born with that hearing loss, and then like taking on accessibility in a more formal capacity, where once I started learning more about it, I became hooked, and that started about 11 years ago, and so my lived disability enabled me to kind of get my start in accessibility. Being hard of hearing, I had been relying on closed captioning my entire life. And so I understood the nuances of when words should break, when phrases should break, when the screen when the word no longer needed to be on the screen, certain hiccups, thing not to do, thing to do for closed captioning, and that segued really well into me becoming a project manager for procuring a closed captioning vendor. And so I learned a lot about that. I learned a lot about the importance of thinking of accessibility during procurement. And and I also, it kind of went side by side with my project management skills. And I really, like I said, once I learned more about accessibility, I became hooked. And even though I lived my own experience, I really enjoy kind of getting to understand other people's journeys. Like, let's say I met a blind user, I have a lot more that I can share with them than I maybe did before I started this career, because I have a much better understanding of how they interact with the internet. And so it's a good conversation starter in that regard. But I think the thing that I take the most meaning from is my work is helping people with disabilities gain independence and retain privacy. And and so I really feel like I can see the immediate impact of my day-to-day work, as opposed to it kind of being like this theoretical, out of sight, out of mind. I see that different. And I also am advocating for myself every day, in addition to many people with disabilities. And so a lot of the skills that I had had before I became dedicated to accessibility just lent itself well. the project management skills in terms of organization really helped me to think strategically. Um, my devotion to being empathetic and leading with emotional intelligence really helped me to understand the users and put myself in people's shoes a lot more easily, because you do a lot of that in the field. Um, and you can rely on the accessibility criteria, the documented accessibility criteria out there. But um, if you met one person with a disability, you've met one person with that disability. You haven't met all the people with that disability. And so you have your compliance standards and you have your success criteria, but they're not enough. Like that's the challenge, is that with
Mhm.
all of these different ways to have a disability, it's challenging to come up with something consistent to provide access, and to remove the barriers that we introduced just with the simple new technology.
Mhm. I'm sure over the last couple decades, you've seen the technology evolve from, as you mentioned, being born with a hearing impairment to today and some of the technology. How what what's the, what's the biggest change that you've seen? Hopefully for the better.
Um, I think the smartphone really just kind of helped move things for the better, because it kind of forced collectively the entire internet to shift how it thought of design. And
Mm,
it had to be a lot more versatile in their design, because desktop was not the only way that we were consuming software. Desktop was not the only way that we were interacting with people. And so when the smartphone came along, it was this much more small viewport, and trying to get all of your web content on that viewport didn't make sense. You really needed to shift to something more responsive. That ended up having a lot of impact on people with low vision, for example, because all of a sudden, websites more and more were adjusting their site to be responsive, and that meant being able to magnify and zoom, at a rate that was consumable, perceivable to all. Um, the other thing I really feel helped along with the smartphone is that the creators, the developers of these smartphones really built in accessibility features and continue to build in accessibility features. And and so when we are designing um, for our customer, for our users, we are having to keep in our mind that just because we're making it look a certain way doesn't mean that the smartphone user isn't going to have the colors inverted, for example, or not going to have their text maxed out. Generally, as you get older, you need larger text. And so with these features built into every person's device, you don't have necessarily a look and feel that fits everyone. And being able to to change that and create that on your own, you need to be able to adjust. So a lot of accessibility, I think, became like being able to support like assistive technology, but also shifted more to being able to support user preferences.
yeah. Well, I'm glad the topic of compliance and the standard versus the usability came up early in the conversation, because they're totally different beasts, right?
Mhm.
I think just in the last week or so, Apple announced another major batch of accessibility preferences that are being made available to the user,
Mhm.
which is great. And so you were saying, as technology advances, how does accessibility keep up? Well, all of this new functionality that the operating system or the device is adding means that there is an improvement or a different implementation that um, product teams and folks from a design and technical perspective need to think about, right? So I hadn't really thought about it that way, that with the rate that technology is advancing, is the accessibility solution that you've implemented able to keep up?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so project management from a product perspective, living through probably a couple decades prior to getting into your professional career, um, with your hearing impairment, did that change or have an influence on your need for additional training, education, um, and awareness about the strategies to be a great program manager in the accessibility space?
So program management in the accessibility space is tend to be kind of siloed to an enterprise, and hopefully at that an enterprise level, as opposed to what I've seen in my career at the ground level, where it's kind of like grassroots, where you have people on the ground really pushing up, trying to get some adoption of an accessibility program. When program management is done at the enterprise level, you it's really a good opportunity to kind of see all of the areas that just need to be improved anyway. When you are talking about incorporating accessibility into design, into product discussion, into engineering and testing, you start to uncover kind of like all of these gaps and inefficiencies overall. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you start having that accessibility conversation, it really opens the door to um, improvement overall. So accessibility benefits all, but it's also just good business. And as technology changes, one of the things that we have to really take into account is like backward compatibility and um, and reducing maintenance. So some people or some developers, when they first start learning about accessibility, they're like, it's too big. And they might use ARIA. So that's ARIA,
Mm-hmm.
accessibility rich internet application. That that right?
Yeah.
I can never quite remember the um the acronym. So many acronyms. But they look at ARIA and they're like, oh, this is great. I think I'm just gonna tack on ARIA, tack it on. And but that's not backwards compatible, and that's not um, best practice. And so we've really seen with technology shifts that following best practices, sticking with the expected behavior really helps to keep things maintainable. Because sometimes when the developers want to do something, they do something custom. And they're like, Apple doesn't let us do this in our app. So we're going to do it and we're going to create a custom component. Well, that custom component gets kind of wiped out if Apple creates the same thing, or it becomes a maintenance nightmare and more expensive if Apple makes tweaks to their component, and then you have to account for that. And so with accessibility, it's really bringing in a lot of need to be consistent and still creative. I think that sometimes people fall into the rut of thinking that accessibility isn't creative, but
It's hugely.
um, it really can be, and it can be a really beautiful thing when you are kind of seeing the tool that you have in front of you and making it create the picture that you want. Whenever I think about like the use of accessibility and people thinking that it's so limiting, I think of Apollo 13. And I know that's really random. But Apollo 13, when that, um, I'm not sure what to call it, like an accident or something happened, um, the people on that ship had to use what they had available to them to create a workable solution.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like people, when you have something in front of you and that's all you have to work with, that really makes you even more creative. I don't think it reduces creativity. I think it makes you more creative as you consider different ways of doing things. And I feel like a screen reader in the accessibility space is a good example of that. It started out as technology for people who are blind to be able to understand what's in front of them, what the content of an image is, what the label is. But people with dyslexia can also use the screen reader, and it can be something that you can listen to in the background. Like some people get sensory overload from trying to consume content in a single fashion. And so by
Hmm.
having all of these technologies built for accessibility, we're actually expanding the world for multiple groups of people. Um, and so it is interesting how technology changes. It kind of but it's been my experience that as technology changes, it's increasing access as opposed to decreasing it, simply because there are so many benefits to everyone. Texting. Show me a person who has not sent a text message, and I'll show you somebody who's living in the middle of nowhere. So but texting started out as technology for people like me, deaf or hard of hearing, TTY. I forget what that TTY stands for. But everybody text messages, send text messages. And so it's a technology that was developed for people with a disability that had a much broader impact.
The
Um,
universal impact was huge.
mhm, yeah. And I think that sometimes it's a mind shift when we're trying to advocate for accessibility. It's the mind shift in terms of thinking it's not just doing something for a group of people. It is doing something that can have much broader reach.
Mm.
Um, like when you going back to the consideration for people with dyslexia, people with dyslexia aren't really represented in like WCAG or Section 508 or the European Accessibility Act. There's not a lot of representation in those criteria. But if you make things accessible for a screen reader user, you lend that software to be usable by tools that people with dyslexia use.
Yeah, it's
And so,
extendable. Yeah.
yeah, that interoperability is very important.
I love and hope that one day we see the enterprise holistic approach, because you hit the nail on the head. Like the siloed nature, which a lot of organizations just by nature are fighting that very own challenge for other um, strategies of the business, right? That, stay in your swim lane but cross collaborate. So the holistic view that you're speaking about is kind of a great way to ensure that you're not doing the job more than once, right? Like finding out that color contrast isn't met when the development is done. It's it needs to be done, but it's hard to reason with someone who's maybe not as educated in the accessibility space that, hold on, we have to go backwards and talk to the creative team to adjust something on color that now has to go back through the 4 or 5 additional workflows that it took to get up to the point that the developer said, well, I'm going to test for accessibility before we release. It's like, if the enterprise strategy looked at it from the content supply perspective, it would have made for uh, probably a little bit more efficiency.
Hmm. Definitely. Um, I'm all about efficiency. I'm in Steve Jobs' definition of lazy. Like he once upon a time said that he loved lazy people because lazy people will find the fastest way and the most efficient way to complete a task. And that's me. And so when we apply that accessibility lens on it, like the VPAT is the voluntary product accessibility template.
Yep.
It's important, but if we are able to find more efficiencies in how we catalog and document our own accessibility, that would be ideal as a community. And I think that, and this may segue into your next topic, that overlays are, we have lots of overlays that are kind of kind of encroaching on the accessibility community, and they are providing an illusion of efficiency. And that is,
Illusion is a good
sorry,
word.
I'm sorry.
Illusion is a good word for that.
Yeah. And so, as enterprises themselves start to learn more about accessibility, um, they kind of fall into the same trap that an individual falls into when an individual starts to learn more about accessibility. Is it becomes kind of overwhelming to realize just how much you don't know. Accessibility is an entire field. You can be a project manager, you can be a strategist, you can be a lawyer, you can be a designer, an engineer, etc. Like the list goes on. It's an entire field.
Hmm.
And when enterprises start considering, hey, we need to do this, we want to be, well, hopefully they'll be doing it because it's the right thing to do, but chances are they do it because they don't want to get sued. Let's just be realistic and call it for what it is. They don't want to
Sure.
be sued. Um, and then they start realizing like, hey, if we want to do this right, we have to hire, an accessibility strategist, an accessibility designer, accessibility engineer, accessibility so on and so on. And they have an open position for one person. Uh, and it's like, okay, you're not,
Unfortunate, but I'm laughing because it's true.
yeah, it's true.
Yeah.
And so in trying to really grapple with just the complexity of the situation in front of them, like they haven't built accessibility in from the beginning, they start looking to something like an overlay. And for those on the podcast who might not really understand what that is, an overlay is kind of like some JavaScript that um, that seemed to bridge the gap between what the website had done currently and what you need it to do. And it's an illusion because the number of users who would potentially benefit from that are extremely limited. And it's not interoperable. Generally, people who use a screen reader are going to use and prefer their own. And they're not going to want to use the screen reader that an overlay might provide. But companies think, okay, if I just do this overlay, then I'm good. I'm good. I've taken the quick way out, and it's just because it is daunting, and it's daunting, especially when you haven't been already doing it. Once you get into the swing of things and it's embedded and it's part of your processes, then it's a lot less daunting. But um, as companies start learning more about it, they're just like, it's a little bit frightening. Um,
So I'm curious to know from your project management side of your brain, but also having been a part of the strategy build out, no one is going to go from 0 to 100 with anything, right? Like
mhm.
build a brand new product. Tomorrow you're not going to have the product, right? You might build the
But
skateboard to build up to the car to build up to the next level. What is a recommendation that if you don't have multidisciplinary functions for accessibility, how do you even get started and realize a difference?
so if you are you talking about like somebody wanting to be a professional or somebody wanting
Well,
to
I guess,
hire professionals?
yeah, I'm thinking hiring. So, like on the organizational level, to go from no accessibility roles, or maybe you have a subject matter expert that took it under their own willpower to go and learn and get certified, having an
Yeah,
organization that is multifaceted and enterprise focused strategy like you're recommending as best practice, what are some of the steps to get to that utopia that you're talking about?
yeah. So first and foremost is going to be a realistic funding. You're just going to need to have executive sponsorship. It's going to need to come from the top. It cannot really be grassroots. Because grassroots, the challenge with grassroots campaign for accessibility is the leader of that grassroots leaves, it dies. The accessibility program will die. So
Yeah.
you need executive sponsorship. You need accessibility to be incorporated into like the employee handbook. Um, and I would say like if there's a first step that an enterprise can take, it would be to hire the planner, to so hire on a strategist, but that's the first step. So strategists, eventually the part of the plan they're going to create is going to be hire an accessibility engineer lead, hire an
Hmm.
accessibility designer lead. And accessibility professional, we are able to do a lot, mainly because thus far in our careers we've had to do a lot. And so I have, all of these skills that I have collected over my career, and it's just out of necessity. And in order to actually be mature, that should not be a requirement of your accessibility professionals. I don't have a lot of technical experience, but I have that organizational experience. I have the design experience. I know where the pieces fit together. So me not knowing a lot about HTML or CSS or Java or any of these other programming languages shouldn't be a hindrance to me at the strategy level. I just know that we need somebody like that. We need somebody dedicated to that.
Yeah.
Um,
The leads make total sense. I guess I'm curious to know, and you kind of shared something that gets me excited, which is it should be in the handbook, right? For the, for every 10 developers, maybe there's a lead. Maybe it's a 20 to 1. I'm not sure what the ratio is, right? It probably isn't in most
Probably,
organizations.
yeah, probably not.
Yeah, like maybe it's 100 to
Maybe
1.
it's 100, yeah, 100 to 1. However, you do want to build in like a train the trainer.
Yeah,
Um,
that's what I was going
right,
to ask is like so even though you're hiring a lead is not everyone else is off the hook, right?
right. Yeah, I mean, ultimately, accessibility is the entire organization's responsibility. But you just kind of want to have your central people where it's
Yeah.
like, when again, as an individual learns more about accessibility, they learn just what they don't know. And not having kind of like that go-to person where you can ask some of those nuanced questions can lead to people being like frightened, and it's very daunting. So you
Yeah.
really want those experts in place to help train the trainers. And then what I have found to be quite glorious is that people, when they start learning more about accessibility, start becoming really interested. And then there's a lot of mentorship of those people who are really interested in accessibility. And then they can kind of they start taking the initiative more and more themselves. And so successful evangelism of accessibility lead to more people willingly taking that on. They they see it as the right thing to do, but they also see it as a useful tool in their skill set. They start to realize, like, hey, accessibility is good business, and I want to grow it more for myself. And so that's always a really beautiful thing to see.
I mean, it kind of gets back to like several of the examples that you mentioned. It builds more inclusive, better functioning product for everyone.
Hmm. Yeah,
So what are the biggest disruptions that are coming to accessibility?
AI.
Oh, I'm not going to let you off that easy. AI
Oh no,
is
don't worry.
yeah.
I plan to expand. I plan to expand. So AI is So again, for the uninitiated, artificial intelligence has just kind of exploded onto the scene, and we're now kind of looking into a year of it being part of like everyday conversation. And when you start to realize what AI can actually do, it can become kind of like, oh, it's doing the things that I can do. It can evaluate a site, check it for missing alt text. It can check it for, it can make recommendations on alt text like, hey, these are all the things that I can do as a professional. And so there's a little bit of fear in the accessibility industry that AI is going to come and take our jobs. But when the smartphone came onto the scene, it didn't just replace the web. You still have a good number of users who use the web on a desktop machine in addition to their phone. And so you very rarely have people who have only a desktop computer or only a mobile. Chances are they're going to have more than one device. With AI, it's the same thing. It's just another tool. You're not going to have people who never use AI. You're going to have people who love to use AI and use it every day. Given the quickness with which it has kind of exploded onto the scene, it has kind of advanced beyond where accessibility is. And so AI is only as good as the data that you feed it. And so what that means from an accessibility perspective is if as it's crawling the internet for stories on people with disabilities, and the only thing you can really find are inspirational stories, it's going to create a story about people in terms of like being inspirational, resilient, determined, which is very reductive. It's a very reductive perspective on people with disabilities. People with disabilities run the gamut in terms of the stories, but it's also a very ableist approach when we think about creating stories about people with disabilities. It's ableist to talk about them only in terms of how they inspire us. Um, and, and so AI needs the data to tell it to how to create nuanced stories, nuanced telling of people with disabilities. And it also needs to be trained on recognizing what a disability is. And so TikTok, for example, ran into an issue fairly recently where people with dwarfism were not being allowed onto the platform because the AI that it was using saw them as children. And in doing so, TikTok's AI was being discriminatory against people with dwarfism. And again, it's only as good as a data set if no one thinks to tell this AI, this is a subset of people that you need to include in your data set that becomes a discriminatory AI.
Mm.
The and I mentioned earlier, I like efficiencies, I like simplicity. Humans love simplicity, but when you think of AI in terms of simplicity, you think reductive. You see reductive. And human may not necessarily come to conclusions about the absence of data, but an AI may consider an absence of data as negative. If something doesn't occur, then it's bad if it does occur. Amazon ran into that with this hiring tool. As their team was monitoring the resumes that it was throwing out, they noticed that applicants who had a woman college on the application were automatically filtered out. And they tried to untrain the AI, but they had to scrap it altogether. But basically, there was an absence of data indicating to the AI that because there was an absence, it was not preferred. And as we are thinking about how to incorporate AI into our daily life, we have to consider those absences. We have to consider how absent is actually its own data when it comes to an AI.
Wow. I've had so many folks give AI, which is why I was like, I'm not letting you on the easy way out. That was the best, most comprehensive explanation about the opportunity, but also the flaws in accessibility and AI working together. Emily, we're just at the closeout of the conversation. I always like to leave it with an opportunity to share anything that we didn't get to. Is there anything that you want to close out with?
Um, I think that since I've been seeing a lot of fear about AI, I kind of want to just maybe provide some reassurance. AI is going to be a big disruptor, but accessibility is still dealing with the issues that it started when the internet started. So we're still dealing with 30 years old issues. And smartphones introduced another set of issues. And so what I foresee from AI is not a replacement, but additional considerations, like the next edition of WCAG, for example. I foresee considerations around AI bias, AI ethics, building
Hmm.
in like a triage framework for how to determine whether AI is discriminatory or not. And one example, and I know I've given lots of examples, but I've
There are.
been using AI myself because I'm like, I want to be a part of this. I don't want to be in opposition to AI. So I just started asking one of the AI generators to generate pictures of people with disabilities, just kept doing it over and over again. And something that I noticed was that the pictures were all cloudy days. All of the pictures of people with disabilities were on cloudy days.
Hmm.
And it's a nuance that, with me, with my accessibility lens, picked up on that maybe others wouldn't. And so there's still definitely very much a space for people with accessibility in AI. And our ability to find issues in software and images and labels is only going to lend itself well to really advocating for ethics in AI.
Such an enjoyable conversation. A ton of takeaways. Thank you so much for everything that you shared today. It was a joy of a conversation, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this. Thanks for having me.